Hello, BookTube. Welcome to Book to Film. This week is The Lodger. It was written in 1913 by Marie Belloc Lowndes, and the film was 1926-27 Alfred Hitchcock film called The Lodger, and a story of the London fog. And it starred Ivor Novello. Now, the book actually started out in 1911 as a short story, and then ran as a series in 1913 in the Daily Telegraph, in the newspaper, and it's a psychological sort of thriller, murder mystery, I guess you would say. It's purportedly the first fictional account of Jack the Ripper, even though Jack the Ripper is not the main character. But it's sort of based on the hysteria around that and the murders during the 1880s in London. This doesn't really have an exact date when it's happening. But let's assume it's contemporaneous to when it was being written, so the early teens, because everything sort of points to that. And it's basically from the point of a middle-aged couple, the Buntings. They were servants in sort of richer households at one point. He was a footman and come valet, butler type, and she worked as a maid. But they decided to, well, he had married originally and had a daughter, Daisy, who is part of the story as well. But his first wife had died, and he got married to his second wife, Mrs. Bunting, of the book. And they had invested their savings in buying a house, sort of a lodging house, and to rent out rooms. But they're on sort of tough times at the moment because they haven't had a lodger for a while. Daisy is away taking care an elderly aunt, and it's late in the year. It's getting up to be Christmas time, and there has been in the paper, or well, there's been going around a murder of young women. And Mr. Bunting is very interested in this. That's the one big thing about that. This is the newspapers and the interest that people had to read. He was always ready to run out once he heard the newsboy scream that there was a new edition or whatever, Evening Standard or the Sun. He would rush out and buy the paper and devour it reading, and that's a big part of the story, as we'll see. Mrs. Bunting's not too interested in it, but she becomes interested in the murders. They get a knock on the door, and it's a young gentleman who is wanting some rooms, and she shows him the best rooms, and he's not quite interested in that. She says she has some other rooms that has a stove, a gas stove, and whatnot on the top floor, and this suits him better because he says he has some experiments he needs to do, and he needs the stove. But then he decides, but she doesn't like the idea of a gentleman living on those are a bit rough rooms. So they make a deal that he rents the bedroom and the sitting room, and then that's on the second floor, well, the first floor. Uh, and he's got the use of the other room, so he's the only lodger. So he pays a month in advance. They are extremely happy about this, and the other characters in the story, main one is Joe, a young policeman who is the son of an old friend of Mr. Bunting, and he comes over and they talk, and he asks about Daisy. He's sweet on Daisy. who is 17 at the time, but turning 18. And he comes over and they talk about the Avenger killings, because he's sort of insider story regarding this, and he gets put on the case as well eventually. And as I say, Mrs. Bunting is not interested in any of this. She thinks it's distasteful, but she hears her new lodger, Mr. Sleuth, sneak out at night times, or very quietly go out. He says that he does go out on a walk during nighttime. And she hears this, and then every time she hears him going out, the next day, there's a murder of a young woman. So she's starting to get interested in this, and it's working on her psychologically, and it's also working on him, Mr. Bunting, as well. But it takes him a while to get to the point of suspecting the lodger, Mr. Sleuth. Daisy, in the meantime, comes back because there's scarlet fever in the house where she's staying, helping her great aunt. So she gets sent home. Joe's happy. He comes over, and he's been put on the case as well, on the Avenger case. And so they talk about this all the time. And there's a double murder as well. And there's going to be an inquest. And for Mrs. Bunting, who was never interested in this stuff, but she's all of a sudden interested, and she wants to go to the inquest. So she does go, and she sort of insinuates her way in as a relative of one of the victims, because she meets a police officer who sort of makes the way through, because there's just so many people at this inquest. And that's the one thing that the writer is showing, that during the late Victorian times, and like the interest in the public for murders was huge, and they were glued to newspapers at the time, any information, and there'd be huge write-ups in the newspapers about this. And that is shown in the book, of how Mr. Bunting is, and everybody is, because they, the paper boys are screaming in the street, and people are rushing to buy the newspapers, and the cheaper ones sell out. So sometimes he has to pay for a penny newspaper, an expensiver newspaper, to get the story. So he reads this from cover to cover, like, pay every page, even to do with non-Avenger murders. And he's also got the inside story from Joe, the police officer, who comes over, and they have these talks. And he realizes, he doesn't have much connection with Mr. Sleuth, the lodger. The lodger wants to deal with Mrs. Bunting, basically. He wants to be quiet. He gives her money to buy some things, some food. He's a vegetarian, if that makes any difference in general. And he wants her to buy a concordance to the Bible, and he sits there all day reading the Bible with the concordance, making notes in the concordance. And he brought this bag along. And she's curious about this, and so when he's out, she's looking in his room, and she finds like a cupboard that's locked, and she starts moving it around a little bit, and she thinks that's where the bag is, but she can't get it open. But something tips over, and she thinks it's red that's coming out. She thinks it's blood, but then she realizes that it's ink that the lodger was doing. So she owns up to the fact that she was cleaning, and she moved this, and she must have spilt or knocked over the bottle that he had in the thing. So he's a little concerned about this, but the next thing that his bag disappears. So and she's quite certain that he is the Avenger, but she doesn't want to tell the police. She doesn't want to tell Joe, because she is concerned about her reputation with this happening, and he's a gentleman. So there's something else happening there, she thinks. So, but eventually, Mr. Bunting starts thinking the same thing. And he knows for sure at one point where they did find part of a shoe, or a sole of a shoe, that the Avenger left. His shoe fell apart, and then he finds that that same time the lodger buys a new pair of boots, and he thinks that, so he doesn't want his daughter Daisy to be around him, but she, she meets him a couple times, and he offers to take Daisy and her mother, Mrs. Bunting, to Madame Tussauds to look at the wax museum and the murderers and so forth there. So this is where things are coming to a head with everything. They both don't want to. Daisy's doesn't know any of this stuff. She just thinks he's very charming. And this is her birthday weekend as well. That's coming up. So they take he takes Mr. Sleuth takes them both to the the Madame Tussauds, and finds out that there's a conversation going along with uh, the new commissioner of police, and a visiting um, criminologist talking about the Avenger murders, and they think it's the Liverpool murderer strangler, because he was caught and hanged. He was doing religious murders, and he's mentally disturbed, but he escaped recently from the insane asylum with a bunch of gold. It was paid for for the uh, for the workers in the insane asylum. And Mrs. Bunting knows, she hears this, and it just confirms everything for her, because he had a bunch of gold coins, sovereigns, gold sovereigns, and it proves to this. And then he thinks that, he overhears this too. Well, she's trying to warn him, to stay away from this guy, because he might recognize it, because there was a judge there as well. Um, but he thinks that he's betrayed her, and basically threatens her. But he gets out of there, and then he just disappears, and that's where near ends. That all of a sudden the stories end. I mean, the murders end, and but he never came back for his clothing or his money, his gold. She sends, you find out through the story that she sends it anonymously to a foundling home, the gold. And at some point, I think in the spring, there is, in a park, they find a pair of old shoes, with the part of sole missing, and a knife in a package wrapped up in newspaper. But there's no sign of him, and they haven't said anything, because they know that he's mentally disturbed, and but he's a gentleman as well. So they don't. They're scared on many levels. They're scared for their lives. They're scared for being ostracized, for having him in their home, and everything. But also too that they don't feel that he's responsible for the murders that he's doing. So they have kept quiet all this time at the end. And the interesting thing about the story is, they're not quite, they're not trying to figure out anything. It's the psychological aspect of what the murderers do for the people reading the papers, and the suspicions that they would get. And it probably, for Jack the Ripper and any of these things, there probably were lodging houses that people thought that their lodgers were a murderer or something like that, because it was happening at the time. Especially if it shows up, if they show up at the opportune time of when this is starting, and so forth. And it's just, yeah, and then the way people are glued to the newspaper for information, it was sensational information, and there was like lots of drawings of the sites, and of where they were killed, where the victims were, and all sorts like that in there, and interviewing witnesses and everything like this for the newspapers. Like they just really strung it out to make understanding. And there's been a lot written about this. Like even George Orwell wrote an essay on the English murder. Uh, you know, and how it's riveted people. And there's a whole book that the Victorians created, sort of modern crime, by what's your name, Fellows, I think it is. I've got it here somewhere. Sorry, I should have had it out to show it. But there's been a lot written on this about the English murder and the interest that the public have in this. So we roll on to the 1920s with Alfred Hitchcock, and this is sort of his third feature film that he directed. One of them, the one previous to this, to The Lodger, is Gone. And I can't remember. Well, anyway, it's the third film that he made, The Lodger, and he took some liberty. Like it's pretty close to what's going on, except like they get into a little bit about the newspaper aspect in the story and how it affects people, but not so much. It's just sort of that part is toned down. But they bring the daughter back, and apparently that was done at the pressure of the studio to have a love interest for Ivor Novello, who's playing the Lodger character. And they also changed the ending where he's not the Avenger, he's not the murderer. It was mistaken identity, and then Daisy gets together with him and has a happy ending, that type of thing. But it's visually quite interesting because it is people I've talked to at times, they say, oh, they can see aspects of later Hitchcock in there, and Hitchcock sort of thinks this is his first really good film that he made. And there are things, and there's two versions here. This is the Criterion. This is Region A, so American Criterion. Alfred Hitchcock, and it's really good. It's got a bit of an essay in it, just a full load essay, but it also has some good extras on it. It's got a sort of a review essay by trying to. Can't think of it. I can't see his name here, but it's quite good, and he points out. Sometimes I'm a little hesitant to say these kind of things, like these tropes or whatever you want to call them that Hitchcock had, but he does have camera angles that are interesting. He likes, like, it's clear that he likes Hitchcock likes stairways. It's integral to many of his films, and the way he positions the camera on the stairways is kind of interesting, and you can see the birth of that type of thing here, and also using framing aspects, either pictures or framing the person in front of a picture or a mirror. And in this one it's pretty good because there's a scene where you got the Lodger facing the camera's here, and he's standing beside a mirror. The mirror is showing a picture that he's looking at. So it's interesting because with the mirror, you've got us as the camera looking at the Lodger, but also seeing what he's seeing. And it's all framed in this way, like a picture. And that is quite interesting, and Hitchcock used that type of thing later on, and he uses his sort of red herrings throughout, or the MacGuffin as he calls it, and he also shows, actually he has two. This is the first time he did sort of a cameo appearance. He's in there twice in this film. He's at the beginning where they all of a sudden it opens with the victim screaming, with lights, and in the artwork, like the Art Deco titles are really interesting because they're German expressionists, like with coming to a point at the bottom, like a triangle, and then going upward, uh, and and then it goes into almost like a documentary style of newspaper, and in this case it's the Evening Standard, of them printing the story, going on the teletype, and then there's Hitchcock showing from the back at a desk on a phone, moving his hands around, and above him, through there's a window, and people are doing everything, and it's sort of, it's been interpreted as that he's directing the action, while he's on the phone and doing this. And then the other one is that when the mob is ready to kill the lodger, he's there, right at the front, trying to get them to, continue and kill the monster killer. And there's just lots of other things and shadows. Like I say, he's definitely, the Mrs. Bunting's bedroom, when they show it, is very. It's like once you see it, and if you've seen the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, right away you see the German expressionist lighting and everything for this, and it's like, so because he actually was in Germany a while, and he learned techniques, and he actually had German cinematographers help him with lighting and the shaping of this, and he actually built on many levels the sort of house, the inside of the house that they're showing, and he had it right proportions so he can show the ceilings, and everything, except there is a incontinuity with this, because there's a very great scene where it's a silent film, but he gets sound in it, but the sound is in your mind, and he does that in many ways, with the screaming of the victim, but also too, after the lodger is in there, they're downstairs, purportedly below, on the room below where he is. However, they're on the right side of the house, and his room's on the left side of the house. So I'm not sure how. But anyway, they sort of start looking up at the ceiling, and you can see the lamps moving, like because he's walking, and the sound. So all of a sudden, the floor dissolves into a glass floor that you could see the lodger pacing back and forth. So he gets sound in there in your mind, because then as you're watching it, you hear the footsteps. You hear everything. So it's very, very clever, what he did there, and that's an amazing shot. And then there's also another shot where the lodger closes the window, and the framing of the panes shows across his face and across his eyes, across. So you get the religious iconography that shows up throughout Hitchcock as well, and that the victims are blondes, and there's tons of stuff written about Hitchcock's predilection to blonde actresses, and his sort of, in some ways, possibly sadism towards them, the way he treated them at times on the set. And yeah, it's just a great film. Yeah, the acting is a little over the top at times, Ivor Novello, but the music in this version is excellent. Neil Brand did the version of this, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and there's a little documentary. He talks about how he created the score for this, and what he did, and how he does it in general with silent film. And just in a few minutes, you do understand. And Neil Brand does know silent film. I've seen a lot of him, with piano live accompaniment in England here, and I've spoken to him many times, and he really knows silent film. He knows silent music. He knows what to put in, and that's where we get to the network version of this. Uh, It has a pretty good booklet, pretty good information in the booklet, but it says in-depth interview with Nitin Sawhney is the guy who did the music. The music is it's over the top. It's intrusive. It's too loud. It's too big, and he's got singing in it too, and it just doesn't work to me. It's like, and again, like, you've got the interview here in the documentary with Neil Brand talking about how he did the just looking at the time, 25 minutes, how he did the music, and then you got it with this guy, and within the first few minutes, this guy doesn't have a clue about silent film. He talks the cliches of silent film that somebody who actually knows silent film wouldn't be saying those things, because they're cliches. They're said by people who don't have not really looked into silent film and learned about anything. They just take the cliches and run with them, and that's what's in here. And so if I'm gonna say, if you're gonna buy it, buy the Criterion version of this. Don't buy this. This is not very good. They both look great, uh, and they were, it's been restored, but that's a bit of an issue with the restoration, because there's so many lengths that have been talked about for the film, and in this one is 90 minutes, um, and it should be about the same for. I can't read; it's so small. But I think they're probably the same transfer, so the same restoration. But this is the one to get, and it's been made many times. In 1932, Maurice Alvey redid the film called, well, in America it was called Lodger here, but in the United States it was released as the Phantom. I was gonna say Phantom Menace, but no, it's the Phantom. Um, uh, Maniac or something. It's Phantom something anyway. Sorry, it's 1932. Maurice Alvey directed it. He was a stalwart silent film director that he basically did over 200 films between 19 teens to 1957 until he started working within TV. And it was written from the book again, but by Paul Rotha and Miles Manders. Miles Manders plays the Mr. Bunting in that version, and Paul Rotha was a film historian. He wrote one of the first films. It's called Film to Now in 1930. It was sort of a world history of silent film in a sense, because that's where the bulk of it was, for being 1930. Uh, but Maurice Alvey, as I say, directed this, and he was a big director, and there is a connection between him and probably more, but the a big connection between him and Hitchcock was that in 1919, I think it was, he directed 18, or somewhere around 18, in the late teens, he directed a film about Lloyd George, the prime minister. It never got released. It sort of disappeared, and its first premiere of it was in the 1990s, in the mid to late 1990s. But as an actress on there is Alma Revelle, I think that's her name, and that was Hitchcock's wife, who actually helped write the scenarios and did a lot of the editing on his films, which she probably did editing on The Lodger as well. So there is a nice sort of connection there. But that's 1932, and Ivor Novello actually reprised his role as the Lodger. They changed a little bit their sound. It's it's okay. It's interesting. And then in the 1940s, there was another one. 1950s, there was another one that's been done for TV several times. It's been done for the radio. Like there is a radio version on this year, but this must be about 5 times it's been done for the radio. Also, what's his name has played the Lodger. The guy who's in M. Sorry, sometimes I just can't think of names. But just a great actor from the 30s, German actor, and he was in Fritz Lang's M as the murderer, and he was in a lot of other stuff. I just can't think of his name. But anyway, you'll know, and somebody, I'm sure, put it down in the comments. I know who it is, but I just can't think of his name. But yeah, he was in Mr. He played Mr. Cairo in the Maltese Falcon. I'm still trying to think of his name, but I can't, so I'm just gonna leave it. But yeah, so there was many versions, radio versions, of this book, and it's a great book. Like, yeah, it's got a few flaws of writing, and as I say, it was done as a serial in a daily newspaper, probably fixed up a little bit. I don't know the full history of it, but it is a very, very enjoyable read, especially the psychological aspect and how reading the newspapers sort of and the Buntings were basically a microcosm of English society, and especially London, during any of these type of things that were happening, whether it be the sensational murders of Jack the Ripper or other murders, that people are glued to the newspaper, or was to the newspaper when before anything else that happened. And that's the interesting thing is in the Lodger, he brings it up to date a little bit because there are cars, so he brings it up to modern times in the mid 1920s. And he also does something that's kind of interesting. He not just the newspapers, there's radio. Like, radio was starting at that time, but in general, radio, they had to wear headphones and listen to it. So he shows scenes of people listening, some men and women listening to the newscaster on the radio, and their expressions on their faces of listening to what you already know are the horrific details of the murders. So and it's showing their with their facial features and sort of blending in, and all their faces blending in together as well. It's a brilliant film, and if you're interested in Hitchcock, it is a key film to see of Hitchcock. Next week we will be doing. I don't have it here in front of me. It's The Dark Eyes of London. I didn't mention that on my Friday reads, but it's an Edgar Wallace book, and it was done in the 1930s with Bela Lugosi when he was here in the UK. The film is called Dark Eyes of London, but I think the American title was changed to something like Monster Eyes or something like that. Monster in the title, like, yeah, something very sensationalist. But and it received the first horror sort of for a public a rating in English film. H for horror. It's too horrific for public consumption, sort of, in a sense. It was given an H rating. So that'll be next week's, and I hope everybody's doing well, and take care, BookTube.